Yeah, on.
Two twins.
Hey, ba ba bow, ba bow bow, bow ba bow ba bow bow wow, wow 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 boom boom. I decided to take the bass line that time. Notice that?
Who's gonna make? I did notice that. Who's gonna make the first?
Hello, my king.
Oh, my king. Who's gonna make the first like Phish pun? I didn't know.
Yeah.
I figured we'd already get to it. You know, like the first like, let's go fishing.
Yeah.
Or, hey, did you catch any fish today?
Something about bait or
right. Or the Nubs and Tea classic. Want to go see fish? And go see fish.
Is that going to come up in the Wonder Stories?
Oh yeah.
Nice. Yeah, nice. Welcome to episode 68, and we're back. It feels like riding a bike. Nub feels like putting on a raggedy old pair of kicks.
Feels like riding a bike if you fall on your face.
Yeah, so far in the first minute and a half, at least, everything's going swimmingly. But we haven't done this in a while, and I don't know if we appear to be rusty. That would be why. But so far, I mean, we played the song that went off without a hitch. We can hear each other, see each other. You look amazing. I mean,
yeah, look really great.
Yeah. I got a haircut yesterday just for the occasion, so,
high and tight, by the way.
Wow. A little bit. Yeah. I'm doing the corporate.
Is that like your corporate look?
Yeah, mostly. I have pictures pop up every so often on my screensaver. Do you even need screensavers anymore? Is there like a functional reason for it? Used to be so that like the screens were so shitty that like you didn't want the image to like freeze on the screen, right? But functionally, I don't think you technically need them anymore, do you?
No, because computers just like go to sleep now and things like that. They have, there's more automation in what happens to a computer when it's left unattended. Yeah. So I knew they had a function. I didn't know the exact function.
I think that was the function, is that if you had the same image on those old screens for too long, that they would like start to create like permanence visually on the screens because they were so crappy. Anyway, I have this screen.
Do you remember what a big deal it was though? Your screensaver was it's like your phone background back in the day. I mean, it was a big deal to have the right screensaver.
Yeah,
it was like
something cool.
It was part of your identity,
Right. Yeah. So my screensaver are like old pictures, and every now and again the ones pop up of me during the pandemic with my beard and long hair, and like sometimes I miss it a little bit, but the corporate high and tight looks okay too. And
I miss your shaggy pandemic look too. I thought it was fabulous.
And let's take this. Let's go ahead and parlay this into today's episode, because the beard and the shaggy look definitely would have made me more on brand, I think, for today's band, right?
You'd have to go a period of time without showering as well. That's part of it. I can still, it's funny. The things that we, from a sensory perspective, remember, I think become waning as we get older, right? From our childhood or from our youth. And there's sights and sounds and, things like that you have a vivid memory of when you were in your 20s and then your 30s. By the time you get to 40s, some of those things start to fade a little bit. I can still channel the smell of the Palace of Auburn Hills when I went to my first Grateful Dead concert. I can still channel it because there's
a smell in the parking lot, and that's in open air. That's in open air.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it's the mix of incense, weed.
Right. Definitely some marijuana.
Definitely marijuana. It's part of this whole thing. but the overriding yet mixed in stench of humanity is just that will, like, I can in an instant bring back the memory of that sense.
It's true. It's true. Well, we're going to get to a lot of stuff. We're, obviously part of the theme today is, and, we touched on the jam band thing a little bit with Brendan Bayless. We focused on an album for those guys, for Humphreys McGee, that was produced and meant to sort of be a bit more mainstream, if you will. And you've seen jam bands do this over time. I think of Till the Medicine Takes by Widespread Panic, and you could probably think of at least a couple from the Grateful Dead. Most people would probably point to Terrapin or Shakedown during that Arista, time period of really trying to get a little bit more into the business of selling records and being mainstream and being on trend. And today's album from Phish is probably their most notable effort towards that. So we're going to talk about jam bands in the studio, jam bands coming out with their sort of mainstream attempts, and sort of the whole thing as a whole, because it's very interesting. It's very interesting musically, and it's very interesting from, sort of the standpoint of the scene, because these things all become sort of a scene more so than people focused on the art itself, bro. Right. So, but hey, before we do that, let's make sure we don't screw this part up. Let's go round and round. No, but we haven't done a round and round in a while, so I'm not sure if it's just what you've been listening to this week or in the last couple weeks or hell in the last month. But what do you got?
Yeah, I have purchased and listened to so much music since our last show. Holidays are a good time for that. For me, it's definitely an opportunity to spend a lot of time in the room and put some things on the turntable that I haven't opened yet. I must have opened 30 records over the last month, just like literally open, like out of the shrink wrap and listen to for the first time. I've also been buying a ton of CDs. I don't know how it is for you, T, but in our community, we've got it's like a vintage clothing store that sells used CDs for $1 and like really good stuff that maybe I used to have on CD and then sold. So I'm sort of like, it's so ridiculous. I'm sort of like replenishing my CD collection because I can buy like 50 of them for $50. You know what I mean? So I will tell you that all three of my round and rounds are things I listen to on CD, not on vinyl. So there you go. First would be, again, a rather obscure album by Motley Crue. And that is the 1997 album Generation Swine, which is a very cool album. This is what brought the original lineup back together with McMars and Vince Neil, of course, after some time with not the original lineup. Cool album. They're definitely tapping into the grunge thing. It's got a couple of their best songs they ever did, Afraid and Flush. And
if I remember correctly, a great album from Tommy Lee, which obviously a huge part of Motley Crue, with his 3 drumsticks that he has.
Yes. Yes, he carries 3 drumsticks with him. Yes.
He does. He carries 3. Yep.
Yes, exactly. Tommy Lee, he never had a bad album. And this was, he's shined quite a bit on Generation Swine for sure. So that's first. Second is something called In the Name of My Father, the Zepp Set. T, this is someone you're very familiar with, and that is the Jason Bonham Band. I know you like his, back in the day studio material. This is again from 1997. And this was a live set that Jason Bonham did of all Led Zeppelin songs.
Oh yeah.
A bunch of like kind of, I don't know, guest musicians, whatever you want to call it. Well, it's the Jason Bonham Band. So I'm assuming they were all sort of members of that.
I thought you were going to say The Art of Timekeeping, which just love. But no, that's a good choice too.
It is. It's really good. I love listening to Jason Bonham play Led Zeppelin music. This set's really good. It does not even come close to comparing to Celebration Day, which, of course, has Jason Bonham on the drums with.
Amazing. The cashmere on that is unbelievable.
I mean, and Jason is so dialed in to Zeppelin music. Of course, it's in his blood. So it's a cool album. It's kind of obscure. Like I said, I found this for, $1 on CD, which was nice. And then lastly, T, just kind of been getting all lit up again with the debut album from Buckcherry. Kind of a band that's been forgotten, really. I know they're still on the touring circuit, I think, in some way, shape, or form. But Buckcherry came along in the late 90s. This was 1999. And just as like a balls to the wall rock band.
I remember hearing For the Movies, which actually we've covered in our acoustic thing. Back then, when that album first came out and being like, ooh, these guys are good, because Lit Up and what was the other hit off that album? Was Sorry out yet? Or
no, that was later.
So I guess it was Lit Up and probably eventually For the Movies, but
Ridin' was the one that came off on the second album. Do you remember that one? Everyone take your place in the video. Video is just the singer Buckcherry. I forgot.
He's so great. He's
just like covered in tattoos.
Yeah. All riled up all the time. It's great.
The video for Ridin', this was an ongoing joke with my good friend from college, Oleander, who's a listener. Hey, Ollie. The video for Ridin', all it was this, God, I wish I could remember his name. But it was basically the lead singer of Buckcherry, Josh Todd. That was his name. It just came to me. It was Josh Todd just standing there shirtless because the guy never wore a shirt.
No, never.
Like just in front of like a white background, just like dancing, singing the song. That was the entire video.
So you guys would sit there and eat wing slingers and just laugh at Josh Todd.
Yes, totally. Yeah. It's an incredible video.
Nice.
I'm sure it's super outdated by now. But Buckcherry, that's the third one. So that's what's running around for me, T. How did you spend your month spinning around? What's running around for you?
I do this thing. It's more song related where I, sort of spend a few months where if I hear something on satellite radio or whatever, I'll mark it down and then eventually, buy it because I still purchase music and get it into my collection. So I'll get to some of those songs on the What's in Your Head. But as far as records go, I've been there's a new album from the Verve Pipe that I'm interested in hearing. Haven't really gotten to it yet, and I think it's an adult album. Not a children's record.
You will never forgive them for that.
I mean, whatever.
That pissed you off so much.
Yeah.
It was kind of.
I don't think I was the only one. But
no, you were not. No.
But Threads is the name of their album. The second is this great band from the 80s, The Alarm, which obviously many people know their song Rain in the Summertime. Spirit of 76 was a big hit for them. And this is their compilation album called Standards. And, really, really solid group, really good collection from them. And then the third is by Steel Breeze, the band that was famous for You Don't Want Me Anymore and Lost in the 80s. It's kind of one of those almost like a Night Ranger, kind of like a just sort of crappy, 80s rock group, but great at the same time, So Steel Breeze, one of the great album covers too. It's like so 80s. It's got this terrible font and this like purple swoon of design. It's, kind of rules. So that is what is round and round for me, buddy. We already kind of touched on, I think, some of the main things that we want to talk through today. You bring a really strong depth of knowledge related to the Grateful Dead, where a lot of this started, and prior to, sort of the mid to late 90s, when this thing really started to turn into more of a genre for the masses. So any initial thoughts just on the entire jam band spectrum, or things that you think would be good to sort of paint the broader picture before we dig into the record and certainly dig into some additional thoughts? Obviously, this was Phish's attempt, I think, at being a little bit more, at least as mainstream as they can be. And we'll talk about production and all those type of things. But any initial kind of broad thoughts on jam bands going more mainstream, or just, the Dead, or anything that you see kind of within the scene right now, New Blaze?
I think there's always been a conflict between the scene and the music. Even as a young lad, I wasn't really thinking this, the Grateful Dead concert when I was 15 and 16, because I was just so blown away that I was enjoying every second. And thank God I did, because a year later we wouldn't have Jerry and those days were going to be done, at least somewhat. I guess I've seen the Grateful Dead like 5 times since, but
some iteration of it.
Iteration of it, exactly. But there's always been a conflict between the music and the scene. And as a kid, I was always kind of upset at the fact that some people would just be into these bands because of the t-shirts or because of the spinning around in the aisleways at the shows, because of potentially the drugs aspect of it, just kind of tripping out and enjoying yourself. I mean, as a kid, I had this conflict internally because it was like, why aren't these people here for the music? Because the music is incredible. I still feel that way when I go to an Humphreys McGee show, and we talked with Bayless about that. It's certainly a Phish show. I mean, these guys are exceptional musicians. And there's some people that go that have no clue that they've put out this outstanding studio material and that they have a lot to say musically, more than just come out and lose yourself and have a good time. So it sounds a little tightwad, and I get it. And I'm aware of that. But I will always feel like a lot of these bands do not get their just, credit when it comes to what they do musically, that it's more about what they do visually from a branding perspective or just the event of their shows. Now, there's a couple exceptions to that. There's a couple artists that are within the jam band scene that I think suck, but I think they suck because of their music, not because of how fun the show is. Right. So
how much you can dance to it, right?
Yeah. The danceability.
You love that danceability factor.
Oh, you get to dance to everything, everything's dance. So that's going to continue to be an ongoing theme as we talk about this album and this band, just like every other band. It would be nice if these quote unquote jam bands are more appreciated for their music more than just the event of their shows or their t-shirts or whatever,
Yeah, the scene element of this is definitely an interesting part. There's one other part that I want to touch on before we really dig into it here. And that is because there's so much you can romanticize so much of the touring element and the jamming element and the sort of escapism element of what these bands meant to a lot of people. And to your point, certainly went well beyond the music in many cases. And hey, with any art, that's okay. Sometimes it goes beyond the art and into what your perceptions are, what your sensations are. That's all part of this. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about this whole thing that gets highly overlooked within this scene is the commerce element. I mean, the Grateful Dead made hand over fist money in their touring. I mean, this was a stadium band that in an era, at least going into the 90s, where they were still active, you had U2 putting on shows that costed, $2 million just to build and execute. These were still, 7 guys or whatever it was coming out with amplifiers and instruments and no screens or production or backdrop and playing, and would just sell incredible amounts of tickets and merchandise and licensing and all these things. I mean, there is a certain, as much as people, again, sort of romanticized a lot of this stuff, there was a certain, and they were able to get away with it a little bit under the radar, capitalistic nature to a lot of this. And Kiss, for example, could just unapologetically go out and license their branding and sell everything under them. I mean, it's become almost like a joke with Gene Simmons and all those type of things of how they turned that into a commerce empire. In a lot of ways, the Dead and some of these others aren't that much different. But these guys never shied away from the monetary and monetization and capitalization nature of this brand of entertainment and this brand of music and performance, right?
Well, there's a reason I mentioned T-shirt earlier, because the reason why that's stuck in my persona forever is because I remember it drove me nuts how many people wore a Grateful Dead T-shirt that could not name one song aside from Truck.
That used to drive you batshit, you know, and rightly so. It
did, because it was a fashion thing. Now, looking back, a little bit older, a little bit more capitalistic now, you know, in terms of being 40 something versus, 15. Now I really get it. And I admire what they did from a branding perspective. But yeah, I mean, people were wearing Grateful Dead T-shirts that had no clue what the band even sounded like. Anybody who's fascinated with business and music, there's 3 kind of case studies which should be examined. You mentioned Kiss. I wouldn't say that because they unapologetically did not retain street cred. Grateful Dead, Phish, and Humphreys McGee, 3 bands who did it very differently from one another. I mean, Phish was probably the least commercial and the most street cred, but still very capitalistic on a lot of the decisions that they've made.
Sure.
But those 3, if you really want to learn how a business can run while maximizing every dollar, yet being credible and keeping your street cred and keeping your quote unquote cool value, which is still one of the most important things in the market today. Those 3 have all done it very differently, but all did it very, very right. Grateful Dead, even though they were selling bears and ties, still kept their cool factor.
Yeah.
Humphreys McGee has done it with technology. They've done it with like just staying really modern. They're younger guys. And trust me, that's a very well-run business as well. That's thriving, at least pre-pandemic. Phish kept everything quite hippie compared to everybody else in essence, but still found ways to tap into the mainstream market and salvage every last dollar, as Johnny Rotten would say, when there's a dollar in it,
As he was talking about turning Public Image Limited into a business.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But Phish did it in a way that was much more kind of hippie, much more underground, but still fascinating business to look at. So it's funny, when we were 16 years old, the idea of us 30 years later talking about the business of these bands seems like a long way ago, but yeah, you make a great point. I mean, the branding of these bands is in some cases just as important as the music, for better or worse.
Well, let's get into it, baby. The Jam Band studio album, and what we're going to focus on is an album from 4 pretty damn good musicians from the Vermont band Phish. Let's get into the nerdy deeds.
You want some dirty deeds? Yeah. You want some dirty deeds?
Billy Breathes was released on October 15th, 1996. Nubs and I were starting to think about graduating from high school, where to go to college, all these type of things. This was, I guess, our junior year in high school. It was on Elektra Records. Now, one of the key parts of this is, kind of the production approach. It was the band's 6th album. And prior to that point, most of the records that they had released were on pretty thin production. And most people, especially within the college scene, sort of remember one of their very early albums, Junta. May have been their first official album, actually, and had a lot of those Phish classics on it. When you think about Fee and when you think about You Enjoy Myself and these type of things, but still very thin from a production standpoint. And that was kind of part of the charm and part of, when you think about OAR or some of these other groups that started within the college scene, production was not terribly important. It was okay to be minimalist. It was okay to be thin. Well, on Billy Breathes, Phish tapped Steve Lillywhite, who, probably was the opposite of that. Now, Lillywhite is not a tremendous overproducer, right? Not somebody who's looking to overlayer. But by Phish's standards, based on the 5 albums that preceded this, Steve Lillywhite and working with Bob Ludwig on the mastering and engineering was a huge step up for them production-wise. And certainly this was set out from the onset to be a much more lush, much more layered effort from them. And you can hear it relative to certainly the albums that preceded this, but even some of the albums that followed. They definitely didn't continue. They did in some cases, but they didn't continue fully down the road of being highly produced in those things. It was recorded in Woodstock, New York. Apparently all of the sessions were early in the morning. So that's kind of interesting. It hit number 7 on the Billboard 200. So it did well. It was a good record for these guys. I believe that was the highest they got on the Billboard charts. It followed up. I've talked a little bit about a live one here, which was their double live record. And Nub, I feel like it's one of the best live albums of all time. The reason for that is because I think that this is a very challenging band to capture live and have it, result in something clean and tight. Now, I love listening to their live recordings, and, there's no shortage of those out there. And I think they're fascinating. And I think that the way that they improvise and the way that they're loose, sometimes a little sloppy, but that's all part of the charm. But a live one captured them in as buttoned up of a fashion as you'll hear it. There's amazing versions of Harry Hood, of You Enjoy Myself, of Bouncing Around the Room. I mean, things that, have become staples. And I really think that, the performance and the production on a live one were just absolutely amazing, to be honest with you. One of the interesting things about Billy Breathes is half of these songs had been played live and half of them hadn't. So when we talked to Brendan Bayless about Mantis, none of those songs had been played live, which was kind of interesting. You've seen some releases over time from jam bands where nearly all of the songs have been on tour prior to the release, but a little bit of a unique play for Phish here in that there was as heavy of an amount of songs that hadn't been played live yet as you typically saw from them by the time they came around to a release. And we'll cover off on which ones of those had been played previous and which of those hadn't. One of the things that's really interesting about the record, and, I always felt like this record should have done better. Granted, it did well, but when you kind of revisit it and when you think about it in of its time, it's some of the better composition that they've had, and it's some of the more radio friendly composition that they've had. And one of the things that Trey Anastasio has mentioned is that they really blew it on the album cover. The cover is this like giant sort of, to use the Spinal Tap, unappetizing picture of Mike Gordon's face, the bass player, kind of making this weird face. And Trey would later say that it ruined the album. I mean, that's a little strong, but I definitely don't think it helped. It was an early example of a selfie. I guess this was a picture that Mike Gordon took of himself, and they thought it was funny. And, not to get too into the psychology of an album cover here, but no, I've always felt like Phish just had a terrible time getting out of their own way. And, they were born and bred in Burlington, Vermont. And I think, sort of hit the mainstream, if you will, certainly from a touring standpoint and certainly, entertainment standpoint. But I always felt like they were a little bit conflicted and never wanted to, get away from being too organic or too, and at times, this spontaneity that I think they were always so interested in actually hurt them. And there were moments where they could have been more thoughtful and weren't. Even a stupid album cover in this case, if they would have probably thought through that a little bit, or probably decided, let's not just be spontaneous here and put something up there that we think is funny. Let's put something up there that will actually help the brand of the band a little bit, help the performance of the record a little bit. So I think that is a little bit symbolic of one of probably the many things we could touch on, where if Phish really wanted to get a little bit more mainstream and a little bit more mass and broad in their appeal, in some cases, they could have been a little bit more thoughtful, a little less spontaneous, and maybe gotten out of their own way a little bit.
So let's be honest, it's a dreadful sleeve, but Phish were the masters of horrible album covers. Horrible. I mean, I can't think of one that really worked. They never got it right. They needed to go to the Grateful Dead and Yes school of branding. establish a brand identity for your band and stick with it. I mean, one of the problems is not just the, terrible picture that's on the cover, but like the font of Phish is different than 10 other fonts that I've seen for Phish. They just never established anything and stayed consistent. I do like their kind of childish approach to the business of music. It did help them to stay focused on their music, but they needed somebody in their lives telling them, guys, this would be a good career move not to put Mike Gordon's face on this album cover.
Right.
And it might be, a good move for you guys to establish a consistent brand identity, because that's sort of what bands in your scene do. I like that they kept everything, they're kind of silly guys. They are. Trey Anastasio is an awesome guy. If you ever just listen to him talk, there's a cool documentary that follows him around during one of his solo tours or something I remember watching. I mean, he is a guy to root for. He's pure, but somebody needed to at some point tell these guys, this might be good for your career, to do this and have them actually listen. I don't know how Elektra even allowed it, to be honest with you, but that's sort of on par with Phish. They had, they never had an album cover I liked, I don't think.
Great points. If I had to guess, Elektra probably felt like the material was really strong. So if they want to be idiots about their cover and their sort of overall branding of it, then, we're willing to roll the dice. But yeah, I do think that, and Trey agrees that, agreed later, at least, that was something that kind of hurt them. Let's talk about the band members really quick. And then I think we might have some decent wonder stories around this one. Trey Anastasio, you mentioned, is, the front man and primary composer, I think is fair to say, although they all contribute, and obviously lead guitarist and just a outstanding guitar player, very creative, has every trick in the bag, every move in the book. He's classically trained, but also a street fighter on the instrument. And when you get that combination going, it's almost like a Steve Lukather type thing. It can be deadly. And, Trey's been able to perform with Phish. He's been able to perform as a solo artist. He's been able to perform with different iterations of backing musicians, and it ultimately all comes down to his ability to play guitar in a very creative way, in a very showman type way. He is definitely a showman on the guitar. And when you get into there's some great videos out there of him with his rig and his effects and his setup. And, he's a real technician, more so than you'd think, in terms of utilizing this hollow body style guitar and utilizing this sustain approaches and mechanisms that he does, and effects and all these things. It's very, very interesting and very cool. Love watching him play, and a great singer. He doesn't have the widest range in the universe, but he has an incredibly distinctive voice. I mean, it's Trey no matter what. And there's something to be said for that. John Fishman on the drums, maybe the most important member of the band as far as output. Trey would be Trey and he'd be doing his thing and the other guys would be doing their thing. But I don't think Phish would be Phish if it weren't for John Fishman. I have this friend, Bridget, hopefully she's listening, who is a enormous Phish fan, has followed them for years, and, has told me repeatedly, and I agree with her the more I have sort of thought about it, that the band wouldn't be the band without Fishman. And when you look at their live performance, or when you look at the ability to take some of the composition and make it very unique and make it their own and make it in the voice of the band, it's very cool. And I know you appreciate it, Nub, for the drummer to have that ability. And I give John a ton of credit for that. Mike Gordon on the bass, huge part of this. But, Mike Gordon is not the first to play bass in this style for a jam band. There's a lot of Phil Lesh there, obviously, and very influenced, but Mike's moves and licks and using the bass as a lead instrument in many cases, and using it as the backbone underneath what Trey's doing at times, or what the other guys are doing at times, tremendously important. He sings on a few songs. He's composed several songs by himself. And big part of this band, I think he's a little bit Phil Lesh light. And I mean that as a compliment, not as an insult. But Mike Gordon on the bass, and then Paige McConnell on the keys. Very critical part of this as well. A very critical part of vocal harmonies too. heavy contributor in terms of a lot of the jam elements, but a lot of the composition and layering elements as well. Paige does a great job. These are 4 tremendous musicians, Nub. I don't care if you're sort of not into this scene or if you're not into this band or, whatever it may be. Anybody who goes to see this band live cannot come away from it without saying, wow, those are 4 really good musicians. So take a chew of your apple and then let me know what you think.
Yeah, this apple's very good. One of the things I like most about Phish is the lineup really never changed. I think there was one other member who was there at the very beginning or something, but it's been those 4 guys the whole way. They haven't made substitutions. Nobody has died tragically or anything. It's just been a rock solid lineup. And there's something to be said for that. Most of the other jam bands have had changes because they've been around for so long. All 4 members are sort of indispensable. You can't remove one of them and have Phish still be Phish. You really cannot. They each have such unique tone and they bring so much to the table because it's a true band. Trey Anastasio might be the quote unquote leader, but all 4 of them are so significant to the entire operation. So I just love that it's the same 4. I love that rock solid consistency. I think that says a lot about who they are as people for sure.
Well, Nub, let's get into it. And this doesn't have to just be about Phish. This can be about, you've already mentioned a memorable show within the jam band community. But really, we can speak to the scene. We can speak to the band. We can speak to, bass teachers and moms, sort of boyfriends. Wherever you want to take it, buddy. Let's get into the wonder stories. Nub, a lot to recall, I think, about this band and this time period. So what do you got?
There's so much, man. I'm sure the holes that I leave void, you will try and fill in because we had pretty shared experiences with this band. So I was a deadhead, a true, legit deadhead when I was, in 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, just super in the Grateful Dead. And I always kind of saw Phish as like a threat to that because people would compare them. My earliest memory of Phish is our mom, who we've mentioned many times on the podcast. She went and saw them because she did have this quasi boyfriend who was also your bass guitar teacher, which is hilarious.
Yeah, we've talked about this dude a couple times. Yeah,
we have. And he was really into Phish, even though he was also into Rush and stuff like that. Our mom ended up going to a Phish show, I think completely, unknowingly about what she was about to see. I remember her coming back and saying, well, the drummer wore a dress and they jumped on trampolines during the show. Right. That was like her 2 major takeaways. And I knew that this was supposedly the next Grateful Dead, which pissed me off. I didn't like that. I didn't like anyone comparing anyone to the Grateful Dead because you can compare Phish to the Grateful Dead in a number of ways, but like musically, they're very, very distinct from one another. And so I didn't like that, but I was like, okay, maybe I'll stay open to this. And my intro to the band was a live one, which you bought. You've talked about it on Round and Round before. And Bouncing Around the Room was the entry point for me, which is an incredible song. It's so good. But the version on the live one is the penultimate version of that song.
No doubt.
The studio version's fun, but the way the song builds, the crowd noise that they incorporate, Trey's voice, the guitar at the end is just soaring. I mean,
Fishman plays it perfectly. There's so many versions of this where he gets a little off or doesn't hit that cymbal crash properly or whatever it may be. And yeah, it's a perfect version of it.
I wouldn't, you just use the word. I wouldn't use it a lot in music. It is a perfect rendition of that song and one that I still listen to all the time. So that was big. And then we ended up seeing them on the Live One tour. We went to the Palace of Auburn Hills. Again, smelly, not as smelly as Grateful Dead, but still smelly. And, it was okay. I was a little bored. I remember they just didn't play any material that I knew. So it's on me. It's not on them, but it was cool to see. It did not compare to the Grateful Dead show. And I kept comparing. I kept doing this thing that I would always do where it's like, oh, this isn't as cool as the Dead, or this doesn't sound as good as the Dead, because you're comparing to the original, the legend. But I do remember that moment. I remember being there. I do have some memories of that. And then since we've seen Phish a few times, went and saw them with you a couple times in the last 10 years, and they've been fantastic, right? I mean, it's been a fun night of music and dancing and, lots of substances all around. And, it's fun. It's fun to see them still doing what they did. They took some time off. I remember I kind of forgot about them. Did they take 10 years off? Something like that. I mean, it was
quite a long, Trey was doing the Trey band and, even Gordon had something going, they've definitely had fits and starts and breaks and those type of things related to their touring and their recording for sure.
For sure. And then the phrase that has remained and will remain in you and I's lexicon, the want to go see Phish, that was said bass teacher, quasi boyfriend. Somehow we ended up in the conversation when they were going to go see Phish.
Yeah, right.
He must have said that like 6 times. Want to go see Phish?
Go see Phish? And our mom was like, I mean, yeah, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. What do you mean?
He probably really only said it like twice, but in our retelling of the story, he says it like 14 times.
When have we ever been known to embellish anything?
Yeah.
Come on, seriously.
Yeah. Fair point.
I don't know, that's there's a lot there, but it all revolves around my experiences with the Grateful Dead and that sort of 15, 16-year-old era. I think we were 16 when we saw them. If I remember right, T, you have to correct me on this. I think Phish was the first show we ever went to that we drove to ourselves.
It could have been. And we took girls.
Yes.
That was part of it too.
So, yeah. So, all right. So fill in the holes, T. What did I miss? And what is your Phish wondrous story?
You didn't miss a lot. I mean, the show in 97 is memorable because it was the first time we ever saw them. It was an interesting set. If you look back, it was one that, had a lot of long, especially in the second set. It was one of those Phish sets where there were like 4 songs and they were all pretty drawn out, but it was neat. It was something you hadn't seen before. It was definitely a bit more, it wasn't as lively as a Grateful Dead experience because, there was definitely a more festive element to a Dead show compared to a Phish show, which was a little bit more, certainly not intense or anything, but more focused on the musicality, the jams. So there was a little bit of a different atmosphere just in general, but it was still cool. It was musical more so than the Dead. And that's not to take away anything from the Dead's execution, but it was definitely, you're wowed by these 4 guys up there producing the elements and producing the sound and producing the experience that they are. It was still very minimalist, which was also cool because at that time, especially these arena shows, you think about U2 and you think about all this stuff going on, that there was so much production and so many bells and whistles that seeing, 4 guys get up there in a huge arena and do what they were doing was very cool from an ambiance standpoint, but also from a musical standpoint. And that's what I think these guys were always very strong in letting the music do the talking, to your earlier point. 2 other things for me. I went and saw these guys 2 nights in Alpine Valley up in East Troy, Wisconsin, with a couple of buddies, one in particular, Oggs, that was a huge Phish fan. And that was really fun because I hadn't seen the band in probably since that 1996 show. So it had been forever. And I think this was their sort of one of their returns. It was kind of like, we're back and we're going back to Alpine Valley, which is a beautiful, amphitheater environment. And we drove out to Wisconsin and stopped in Madison in the way. I mean, it was a great trip. And that was the show, one of the shows where I saw them play 2001 for the first time. And it's an experience. It's really cool. And, often you're hearing what it is and it's like, okay, no big deal. They're just playing the, theme from 2001. What's the official name of that again, by the way?
Also Sprata Zenkaya or whatever.
Yeah. Also Spratch Zenkaya or something. Elvis is what I think of often with that one.
Yeah, but totally. Yeah.
But also definitely think of Phish and playing that in 2010, playing 2001 and 2010 at Alpine Valley. But, you often just either see what they're doing on stage or, you hear what they're playing. But when you're in the crowd during that, when they hit that verse, da-da, like thousands of people chuck glow sticks up in the air. So it's just this explosion of glow sticks that everyone just throws up in the air and they all land on you. It's insanely cool. It's insanely cool. And I also remember they played a great version of Cavern, which they often did to close out the set, which is a crowd favorite and one that I hadn't heard before. So great shows at Alpine Valley. And then the last thing I would note, this is a little bit obscure, but when you and I went to Bonnaroo in 2004, Phish was on one of their breaks, one of their hiatuses. And I don't know if you remember this, one of the coolest sets we saw was Mike Gordon's solo project. And, it was obviously very bass driven, but he also had a great band with him. And they were playing this really cool up-tempo stuff that was really neat. I think it was all instrumental, if I remember correctly. But I remember walking away from that being like, that was really cool. Who was that? Like, I wasn't putting it all together. And it was like, oh, that's the bass player from Phish. And that was one of the there were a lot of memorable moments during that Bonnaroo, when you think of Mars Volta, Secret Machines and Widespread Panic sets and all those type of things. But I do remember, and it was raining, I remember as well. We were walking out of the tent. Yeah. It was pouring on our heads and we didn't care because we were young and dumb and didn't care about anything.
And having a very good time.
And having a really good time. Just the two of us. And I was living in New York and you were living here, and we weren't seeing a ton of each other. So we met down there, and it was brilliant. That was not,
Mike Gordon did do solo work, but this is significant because I really got into this whole thing. But that was a Benevento Russo duo with Mike Gordon on bass. Yeah,
yes,
that's what
right.
It was. And that's why it was so funky, because it was those guys. Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. So some cool stuff related to this band, through our history. And hey, anytime that this band can be one of our first opportunities to drive gals to a concert, just us, no adults. It makes for a fairly memorable, fairly important experience. Now, buddy, say we get into this track by track on Billy Breathes.
I am ready, man. Let's drop the needle.
Put the needle on the record. 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 When the drum beats go like this.
Well, this will probably bring back a lot of memories for people. I know that I was telling Mrs. Toph, who dug into some Phish during her college years. Probably mostly due to the dudes she was hanging out with, Yeah, maybe a substance or two happening during that. But I was telling her about, that we were going to do Billy Breathes, and we ended up flipping through the tracks, and she remembered most of them, but remembered more, interestingly enough, on Junta than on this. But it was kind of a nice walk through memory lane a little bit, which I think part of this track by track will probably take some people back to those years, and maybe even a couple of tunes that you didn't think you knew, but you do. But why don't we dig into it with track one of the more well-known from this album and from this era of Phish, and that is Free. Very melodic, with the piano part and the piano layering, the vocal harmonies, a sound that, was pretty lush at the time for this band. And certainly, I think this was designed to be a single, and you'll hear that a lot throughout the track by track of, tunes that were made to be played live, of course, but also made for radio, and Free's no exception to that. Really like Fishman's drumming, his right hand as far as touch and those type of things on the ride and on the hat was always a very special part of his drumming, and I'm glad they captured that on Free within the studio. Nub, what do you think of track one and the start that we get off to here on Billy Breathes?
I don't know if you know this, but this was a pretty important song to me in high school. It was one of those kind of listen to if I'm down sort of deals, which I had a collection of. Because I was a sensitive.
Were you down a lot, buddy?
Lad.
Were you down a lot? You didn't seem down a lot to me.
I would hide in my room and listen to Free by Phish. I thought this was a magnificent song. I still do. I think, again, it's that swirling guitar work that Anastasio seems to be able to find a way to weave into any melody. It's got a great middle. I really, really like the middle. It's very commercial, the middle section. You could tell that Lillywhite was like, hey, if we do this in the middle, you might get played on the radio. It's got a nice little setup to that outro. The outro is kind of glorious. It's always, to me, been a very uplifting song. And as a teenager, it spoke to me for some reason. I'm not sure exactly why. The music had a lot to do with that. Maybe the lyrics to an extent, even though we're not big lyric guys, you and I. But yeah, this was one of those kind of move me songs that if I was ever a little down in the dumpers, I would listen to, and maybe it would remind me that life wasn't so bad when you're 16,
Yeah. Well,
I need more music like that now that I'm 42. Life isn't so bad when you're 42,
Yeah, exactly. Well, you mentioned Lillywhite. I mean, Lillywhite's a British producer. We touched on it in the Nerdy Deets, but let's keep in mind, I mean, he's won 6 Grammys. He's worked with, closely with, Talking Heads and U2 and Rolling Stones, Peter Gabriel, The Killers, Dave Matthews Band. This is a pro. So to be able to take the ambience of some of these songs, and I think you're correct on Free, where on its face and when played live, it's okay. But the way they were able to sort of capture the emotion of it and the uplifting nature of it to the point where 16-year-old Nubs can sit in his room and, put a smile on his teenage angst, face while listening to it.
Yes,
is a credit to the way they were able to build this track. It takes you into track 2, which gets you a little bit more into something that certainly is a rocker, but probably one that was made to be played live just as much as it was made for the studio, and that's Character Zero.
The truth that I forget. No one taught that to me yet. I see the man bouquet. I see the man bouquet. I see the man bouquet. I see the man bouquet.
Total jam. I mean, a great progression, great feel. I think everything's hitting on all cylinders from an energy standpoint here with these guys. And, they were great when they were really rocking, but not in a expected jam bandy way, but in a true depth sort of way. And I think that Character Zero executes that. It's a great live song. It's a really good track too on the record. I'm a big fan, Nub.
Me too. Do they still play this one?
Oh yeah. They'll pull this out.
Will they? Cool. Yeah. I always wonder kind of what Billy Breathes songs still make the set. I always wanted to see him play Free. Never got to see it. This would have been fun too. It's very stadium rock. It really is. I remember thinking when I first heard the album, gosh, this is heavy, and if Phish remains this heavy, I'm going to like it. And then of course, Phish did not remain this heavy
right
at any stage, but
they never do quite what you want them to do.
Correct. Yeah. Well said. Well said. But it's fist pumping stadium rock. It really is. And this is maybe where Fishman's drumming doesn't quite keep up. I mean, you could almost get that Rick Allen, do sort of deal going,
right.
But instead it rolls along with Fishman's,
I think in the studio, he pulls it off pretty well. But yeah, when you hear him play the song live, he doesn't have quite that bite that they were able to get from him on these particular takes,
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, really cool moment for Phish to show that heavier side, one that I wish we would have seen more in the ensuing work.
So back from a song that I think was built mostly to be executed live to a song that probably was built for the studio and a very well-known song for Phish fans in Waste.
See what I might have said. To hear it, come waste your time with me. Come waste your time.
Probably should have been an enormous hit. And you go back to sort of 96. This really fit the vibe. This really fit both the commercial and I think just the rock radio consumer vibe at the time. So surprised that it wasn't a really big hit. I think it's a song that probably a lot of more fringe Phish fans really love and appreciate. I'm not sure if their hardcore fans are super into it, because it is one that you can tell was built a little bit and certainly executed in the studio to be something that had some radio appeal. I'm surprised it didn't have more. What do you think of Waste?
Beautiful song. This one's a beaut. I really like Paige McConnell's piano work. I think it really lifts the thing. It does stay in a box. I kept waiting for the song to explode at some point. It sort of does a little bit. I think they could have done something even more grand with. I'm surprised Lillywhite didn't get him there, because if you look at some of what he did with Dave Matthews, more ballad-like songs, I'm kind of surprised it never got to that level. But yeah, I always thought this was a very tender moment in the Phish catalog. Really liked it when I first heard the album. This and Free, really the opening 3 tracks, were pretty memorable. But it was catchy too. You can see, I think this gets the highest rating if you listen to this album on streaming platforms. I think that Waste is the one that most people listen to. To your point, it's probably not the hardcore Phish fans, but it's the more fringy fans, which maybe we're both in that category. But it's a beloved Phish song. I wonder, I think they probably still play this one live too, I would guess.
I think so. And listen, I mean, the album, it's a good 3-track start. I mean, Billy Breathes really gets off to a hot start with those 3 tracks that each deliver a little bit something different tempos, different vibes, but it all sounds cohesive. I don't think, and Lillywhite did a good job of this. Sometimes this band can be so sporadic and all over the place that it's hard to get a lot of production consistency where you feel like it is still under the same roof and under the same collective in terms of an album. I feel like you get through those first 3 tracks and you really get an understanding of what they're doing, even with 3 really different looks. And I think it's very effective. So here we go. We got some hand claps in this one, Nub. Who would have ever, I bet those guys never thought they'd be putting hand claps in the studio, but they did as we go from Waste to Taste.
I can see through the lines. I can see through the
Now, I like when Phish goes in this direction. I think that some of the, sort of they would get a little bit rhythmic and a little bit salsa-y and those type of things. I always thought it was very cool. And I think that they pull it off well. This is probably one of those songs that Lillywhite, I would guess, spent a lot of time on in making sure that rhythmically and making sure that in terms of the energy of it, it comes through nicely. Obviously a great drum performance. Want to make sure and get that drum lick in there for you, buddy, from Fishman. But I actually think after you get through the first 3, it's nice to get a little bit of this different direction. And I think they pull it off well studio wise with Taste.
There's some composition aspects of it that I have a problem with. First of all, it continues this thing that you talked about in the Nerdy Deets so well about that this is sort of the commercial album from Phish, which is interesting because it's really not that commercial. But for them, it certainly is. Trey is writing hooks. He's writing hooks. I can see through the light. That's a hook.
Yep.
But they kind of screw it up by taking this hook that, I mean, you could build a real song around that. You could build a hit song around that. And when I say screw it up, I mean commercial potential, right? I mean, the songs of, you like it, a lot of people like it.
Yeah.
But they take this hook and they just like throw it in a blender, and all these different like polyrhythm things and stuff. It's cool, but it distracts you big time away from what could be a pretty powerful hook. I wonder if they had a do-over, if they'd want to go back and make the song a little bit more focused and a little more cohesive from a rhythmic perspective so it could be played on the radio. Again, we call this the commercial album because it had a couple songs that potentially could have been hits. This is not one of them, but it could have been from a pure composition standpoint. But I do enjoy that it's an album with frequent attempts at hooks. Like anytime you take somebody who's not used to writing hooks and ask them to do it, I always think you're going to get an interesting listen.
So Free and Taste had both been played live before. And this next one is another example of a song that they had played live before and decided to put it on Billy Breathes for track 5. And that is Cars, Trucks, Buses. nice instrumental. You can see Nubs right now is, well, you can't see it, but he's really jamming on the air drums over there, especially that ride cymbal. Cool instrumental. It is what it is. It's not anything landmark, but I think it's neat. I like when they get into that funky stuff, which I think they pull off nicely.
I mean, dude, one thing you know about me, I love a good instrumental interlude.
Oh, yeah.
I love it. Like, you know, one of the earliest albums I got into, Yes, Fragile with the 5% for nothing.
Just a mess. What did we used to call it? The mess? Or,
yeah, I think you did. Yeah. But it was just this like 40-second instrumental interlude that came out of nowhere. This sort of reminds me of that. It's a little bit like the Beastie Boys with Ill Communication. You know, that's what it kind of is consistent with in my mind is these little instrumentals that just kind of have. Well,
not just Ill Communication. Check Your Head. They did these instrumental interludes all over the place. That's a good comparison. It's true.
For sure. Yeah. They just, to me, they seemed a little funkier on Ill Communication. Maybe that's wrong. You go back and listen to episode 3 if you want. Was that when we did Check Your Head?
It was early.
Yeah, it was one of the first few episodes.
Yeah.
But for a full examination, if you will, of Check Your Head. But
that's right.
Yeah, I love a good instrumental interlude. I think it comes at a good place here. It reminds me, you know, you talked about when we were at Bonnaroo and we stopped in our tracks to see Mike Gordon play the bass. Sounds a little bit, you know, Benevuto Russo duo like, you know?
Yeah, good point. Good point. It sure does. Hey, you mentioned Yes. Speaking of Yes, this next song is called Talk.
Nothing's ever soaking through the filter that surrounds your thoughts, and holds out lessons left or taught. I can't sing my song with you.
I think it's nice, you know, that I think it's cool how not every moment on this record was meant to blow you away, right? You do have the instrumental interlude that you talked about, and now you have just kind of a chill, you know, probably I would imagine pretty Trey-driven acoustic bass song in Talk. So, you know, typical Phish record, it takes you in a lot of different directions, but again, I feel like it fits. You know, I feel like the production on this was consistent to where even when you're taken in different directions, you don't feel like you do on many Phish records that you're just being taken in too many directions, or like this sounds like it was recorded during a totally different session with a totally different team. So I like that about Talk. It is what it is. It's kind of another, I almost considered it another interlude. This was something that, you know, hadn't been played out before. So something a lot of fans were hearing for the first time.
Dude, I love Talk. Easily one of my favorite songs in the album. It reminds me, you know, I think of Trey like sitting, you know, by a body of water, just writing, very peaceful, you know. It reminds me of
probably exactly how it happened.
Right?
You know,
totally.
Wouldn't be surprised.
I love when Phish gets into that atmosphere of like a Vermont river flowing, you know, downstream, just nice and easy. Do they have rivers in Vermont? I hope they do.
I don't know, but now you got me all relaxed. You know,
I'm telling you, it's so serene. I love when they get to this place. And it works well for Trey's vocal because he's got a very sweet voice, and it works perfectly when you get this sort of fluid, liquidy kind of thing going on. I love it.
Yeah, his voice is so like genuine, you know, it's not the greatest voice you'll ever hear, but to your point, it matches like his personality because he's a pretty sweet guy and isn't trying ever to do too much, but it's very distinctive. I love Trey's singing, to be honest with you. All right, we got one that had been played live before, and I think a good example of the way Phish could really create moments. You know, part of what's appealing about Phish music and appealing about the fan base having their favorites and having, you know, the songs and the moments that they love is truly creating moments within their composition. And I think Theme from the Bottom captures that well, a live fan favorite here. I love that build up, you know, and when Fishman comes in with those hard drums, I don't know if that was Lily White or the guys, but really, really neat. way to close out the last minute or so of that song. It's a great live song. And I think again, they were good at sort of creating these memorable moments within their songs that either you remember from a live show, or in this case, you remember from something that comes in the middle of the album that I think is a pretty good pivot point and, provides you with something nice to take away, that these guys aren't just creating tracks and aren't just going for pure commercialism, but they're also trying to create a mood and an ambiance. And I think it's another example. And they've been able to take this same ambience of this song and produce it well live. But on the record, I think they did a nice job of Theme from the Bottom sort of accomplishing what I think they intended it to.
Yeah, I don't need to ask you if they still play this one live, because this is sort of one of those live classic staples. Right. I think this shows up regularly for sure. What I like is that it's one of the more rare examples where the band all wrote together. And wasn't Trey a guy who didn't write his own lyrics like Garcia and Bob Weir?
Actually, both he and Mike Gordon, because Mike Gordon had some composition that he solely wrote, contributing toward Phish, and both of them had lyricists. So apparently everyone in the band sucked at writing lyrics.
Well, super jam band thing, Jerry had a lyricist and Bob Weir had a lyricist, but this is all members got writing credit for this. And you can feel that band aspect. This does sound like them in their jam space creating together. And that might be one of the reasons why it's lived on as a live track. So I'm sure you've seen them play this live, and I'm sure it's great live.
Yeah, it really is. It's a great, and it's a great build toward that ending point. Those guys, they certainly knew how to crescendo at times properly. And that's an old jam band live trick. And I think they did a good job of creating that here in the studio, which isn't always easy. Well, to your earlier point, here's a Mike Gordon song. Also had a lyricist, just like Trey did, and it's Train Song.
They were blurry and green, outer space in between, with a depth in a form unclear. Then we saw it up ahead, a flickering lantern lit up on.
I really like, and who knows if this was them or Lillywhite, but that low end cello or whatever that is, sort of delivering the aforementioned bottom to Train Song, I think is neat.
I agree. I just thought it was a synth. You're right. It might be a cello.
Could be a synth.
Yeah,
could be a synth. But delivering the bottom line there is cool. It's a good layer. I think it's needed. Otherwise, it may get a little boring.
Yeah.
And, not all of Mike's contributions are my favorite. But, I think, again, you're making a lot of waves here on this record and creating a lot of different ambiance directionally. And I like it.
It's not my favorite. It's a little ditty. I do like that low end. That's a good call. That kind of makes it for me, actually. If it weren't for that, I would definitely pass it up. But this was one of those in the CD days. I might just, next. Because the album gets into some more interesting things after this for sure.
Well, this next one is interesting in Phish folklore because they didn't play it live for 22 years after this record came out, and then decided one day to pull it out. And I guess it was pretty cool. It's very pure in its, composition and production. It's sort of what takes you into a little bit of a longer, I guess for this album standards, bit more epic piece with the title track. But before we get there, we get through Bliss. Again, great low end there. I'm going to go ahead, Nub, and take it into Billy Breathes because it does serve as a little bit of a prelude to it. So let's go right into the next track, which I think Bliss was really intended to set up, which is Billy Breathes. It's pretty cool. It's got some movement to it. It's got some different parts. It's got some kind of sweet ambience to it, but also as we're listening to this section that we're kind of fading off from, some moments where there's some depth and a little bit of intensity, some great piano work from Page. I feel like we're saying that a lot. He's definitely the unsung hero of this band in many cases. But the way Bliss and Billy Breathes kind of work together, I think is pretty cool. It's a song Trey wrote about his daughter, which obviously is a cool element to it. So I don't know that this is one that they play a lot, Nub. I don't know that it's one that Phish fans will think of a lot. But what do you think of the title track? I always have that track I'm particularly interested in. What do you think of this one?
I think you nailed it. Intensity. This is where things get a little more serious. I do like Phish's whimsical thing, but I love when they write really serious, focused music with some intensity. And this is a great example of that. Again, Page is sparkling here. I mean, his piano is such an important part. It reminds me a little bit of Genesis. You know, people always said that Phil is Phil, but Tony Banks is like the true irreplaceable member of Genesis.
Yeah.
Page brings a little bit of that to the table. I mean, could you imagine this band without him, without his layers and his melodies and just that trademark piano tone that he plays with? I mean, he's just super important. I love Billy Breathes. I think it's a good late album kind of gem, maybe even a little bit of a pinnacle, because I do like the way that Bliss sets it up and the way that those two songs work together. So yeah, there's a really, I don't know whether they ever play it, but they should play it every once in a while. It'd be a good one to trickle in here and there, because I think the, longtime hardcore fans would enjoy it for sure. I really love this song.
Hey, how did Tony play at that Genesis show you went to?
Oh,
was he great?
Yeah. Yeah. Of course.
I bet, with, and you mentioned it, you mentioned that Rutherford was on fire too. I bet that with Phil not being able to drum and him being pretty immobile and those type of things, even though his son kicks ass, I bet that Mike and Tony just stepped up their game even further, if I had to guess. Would you agree?
No doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt. Absolutely. And they both look like $1 million. I mean, they really do. And they sound great, but yeah, they definitely picked up some of the slack for Phil just not really being able to do much and certainly not be able to play the drums. We're going to turn this into a Genesis podcast, always.
Let's do all three of these at once as well, because there's sort of two short interludes and then the closer, which is obviously a very well-known Phish song. So we start it with Swept Away.
Intrudes all day till I'm finally swept away. Finally swept away. I'm finally swept away.
Now, I hate that this is a 1:15 song. Like, it's awesome. Why didn't they turn this into a full song?
100% agree, man. 100% agree.
And
I know.
again, this is where these guys just drive you nuts. The next one is, and we'll talk about all three of these, but the next one is Steep.
It is surrounding me, the seething crowd intrudes all day, till finally I'm swept away. Although I thought my roots were deep, rivers that I sank them into hillside steep.
Okay, this one I'm glad is only a 1.5 minutes, so the opposite. But both of these sort of short interludes take you into a certain Phish favorite and the closer of Billy Breathes, and that is, Prince Caspian. Sort of takes you out of Billy Breathes in a rather memorable fashion. This is a song that Phish fans love and they play live all the time. And, they had played before, so there was some familiarity to it, but I think they do a good job. Swept Away being a short interlude is ridiculous. It's so good. Steep could have just gone without that one. And then, I think they do the job they need to on Prince Caspian to wrap up the album. So, Nub, what are your thoughts on that sort of final trifecta that takes you into the final track?
Well, my one thought is, come on, just.
Yeah. To be Prince Caspian. Yeah. Just a lot of that going on.
Yeah. I agree completely on Swept Away. It's like the scratch that never quite gets itched, if you will.
Yeah.
But yeah, Caspian, you could see again why it's a good live song, interactive, I'm sure. But I think a nice summation to an album that, I'm sure if you ask hardcore Phish fans, there's going to be people who say, oh, I don't like Billy Breeze. It's too polished.
Right.
But I guess that's one of the things I really, really like about it. And the conclusion is a fitting one for that. There's a couple things on here that have lasted long into their live set, but for the most part, the polish on the album is there top to bottom. And I think you really feel Lily White again in that closing 3 tracks, especially with the Caspian bit. So it wraps up an album that I'm glad we got a chance to talk about because it sure is an interesting one in the Phish catalog and a very interesting one from the 90s.
Well, it certainly is one, to your point, for Phish fans and certainly one for those that just follow this genre as a whole. I think it's one that's worth talking about, worth discussing, worth debating. Nubs, do you think it mattered?
I think it mattered because one of the only reasons we're still talking about Phish is this record. I have to imagine that this gave them a boost financially and in terms of kind of their mainstream, quote unquote, audience that lasts into today. I don't think I would still be interested in Phish if it weren't for Free and the Billy Breathes album and the tours that came from it. This took them up a level. It did elevate the awareness of the band and it made them a little more tangible. And I think it's a significant part of their catalog from a studio album perspective. And if you're into these jam bands, listen to the studio albums. And that's one of the other reasons I think it matters. It's a reminder that these studio albums are worthy. We talked about that with Bayless. Don't just get hooked on the live experience and spinning around and all that stuff. It's about the music, and the studio albums are a very, very important part of capturing where these bands are at musically at a given time. So I think it matters, dude. I really do. What do you think?
I think it's a good example of getting close, but sort of no cigar in terms of, I think what some at least originally wanted to do with this record. I think musically they wanted this to break through. You can tell by the first 3 tracks that there's commercial intention here. But whether it was the band or whether, to your earlier point, it was the band's management or whoever, I think that they always were almost paranoid about not wanting to get too unorganic or too commercial. And that's okay. I mean, it's certainly been part of their charm over the years. But I think that whether it's the album cover or sort of the branding of it or sort of some of these interludes that could have been songs or whatever it may be, you can tell that there was hesitation. And I think that that's part of what's always held Phish back a little bit from being overly commercial. And listen, I don't think they ever wanted to be. So this is not a criticism or, oh boy, they're so stupid. I mean, they've been around for a long time. They still sell out their shows. They've made more, right decisions than wrong decisions. But I think it could have been an album that mattered in terms of really showing that the sort of prowess of a quote unquote jam band and a live band to really do something special in the studio. I think they could have got there. I think there are elements here that showed that they were in the ballpark, but they didn't quite close the deal. And I think that's more than anything probably due to the fact that they didn't want to. And that's okay. Every artist has their own goals, their own objectives. And, back in 1996, it would have been really easy for them to, sell out or go too commercial or whatever. And you can tell that they tiptoed on that. They were hesitant on that. And that's okay. But I do think that it took away a little bit from what could have been an album that really was special in terms of them generating mass, mainstream appeal. And they've done just fine. And they obviously didn't need that. But that's the one thing I feel with Billy Breeze is that it could have mattered a lot more historically than it does. And I think that's mostly because they sort of held themselves back. And all in all, while that could be viewed as a little bit disappointing from the standpoint of this had the ability to become a classic if done correctly, instead it's just a really good studio album and a good example, along with Till the Medicine Takes and some others, of a jam band being able to go in the studio and pull it off nicely. All right, Nub, let's get your final cut. This will be interesting. Do you have Billy Breathes by the Great Foursome Phish on the turntable, in the collection, collecting dust, or for sale bin? What do you got, buddy?
You know, this album is like, it's like the other side of the 90s. The 90s was not just Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Oasis. There was all sorts of other things that happened in the 90s that people should find out about. In that sense, I have the album Collecting Dust, because I think that a good collection has quintessential moments from each decade. And the 90s, you can't just get cornered into that it was just grunge and post-grunge and then like the pre-millennium stuff. There was a lot going on in the early and mid 90s that were very quintessentially 90s that did not sound anything like Nirvana. This is a terrific example of that. It's very, very 90s. The production is 90s. You're capturing a band at a place where the 90s were an influence on them. And that's why I think it's Collecting Dust, because it should be in there. It's not quality enough, you said it perfectly, to listen to top to bottom regularly. It's not. There's too many things in there that never reach their potential. And that's sort of a Phish thing, right? I mean, they're just always trying. They're always on that hamster wheel, just trying to run a little faster and complete whatever they're trying to complete. But yeah, I got it Collecting Dust for that reason, T. I'm interested. Where do you have it?
I'm going to the for sale bin, Nub, and that's not because it's not good or because it doesn't have great moments, but you know, I don't know that there's a Phish album for me that's beyond Collecting Dust, to be honest. And I think the only one that probably is even in consideration for that or possibly greater is Junta, because that's sort of the album that started it. That's got a lot of those classics, and it's got it in a bare bones way that I think is good. I don't think they really ever cracked the code. And even with this record, you know, there's too many moments of hesitation, too many moments where you can tell that they were maybe overthinking it. And I think you get that from the cosmetics of the album just as much as you do from the content. And, you know, again, that's okay. It's not to take away from this having really strong points, but I don't have a need for this in my collection. I think there are moments from it that you can pull. I think, you know, you mentioned a couple of really good songs. I think it's a great 3-track start, but I'm going for sale bin because I don't know that besides Junta, there's a Phish album that really would need to be in my collection. And, you know, and it's one that I think could have been great. It's in some cases, you get a little bit of a vibe of disappointment because you realize if they would have gone all in, how great and classic it could have been. But hey, you know, they're smart guys. They've figured it out. They've been around for multi-decade. And so, you know, I think they've swung and missed on more of their studio albums than not. But they are an outstanding band, a band that I love, a collection of musicians that's really special. And I'm pretty sure me putting Billy Breathes in the for sale bin won't hurt their career at all.
I think they'll be okay. Yeah.
All right, Nub. Hey, why don't we check in with Dolores? You know, I don't even know. It's been so long. You know, I kind of often wonder how she's doing. Dolores, how you doing over there?
Let's see if we can wake her up. Yeah, there you go.
Everything good? Did you have a nice Christmas? Good holiday? Good New Year? Okay. Well, it seems like she's doing fine. Nubs, what's in your head, buddy?
Man, good to hear from Dolores, I would say. But round and round for me. So first would be Supernova by Fear Factory, band that just put out a new album recently, but then immediately lost the front man of the band. So go figure. But yeah, Supernova, that's one of their kind of more obscure songs that popped down in the last week and always a jam. The before mentioned Genesis, but without Phil Collins, There Must Be Some Other Way, my favorite song off of Calling All Stations, the 1997 album. Seems to be a theme right now, 1997. We've said 1997 on this show like 50 times. So it seems to be a running theme. And then, of course, it's winter. So I'm listening to a lot of metal. And that means Slipknot with The Negative One, which was the lead single off of the Grey Chapter album. So, T, that is what's been in my head. I think I said round and round. In my head. T, what has been in your head?
Oh, you blew it. You know, I mean, God, we got this far and no time off hiccups. And here you go. You just screwed the whole show up.
The rust finally shows. Yes.
No, but I mentioned earlier, I tend to sort of pile up different songs, and then I finally get around to sort of during the break, I went and I had like 10 that I'd listed, and it's like, you got to download these or make sure that they get in your collection. The first is by Dionne Warwick, Nub, and that's called No Night So Long. Great track. It'll bring a tear to your eye if you're not careful.
We're going very obscure today.
That's right.
I like it.
The second is by a band called the Amity Affliction. I heard this on the Metal channel on Sirius, and it's called Like Love, which is a good jam. And sometimes when I'm working, I'll just turn that. It's called Turbo or whatever, but I'll get that one going. And then another one is the Clapton class. I kind of liked some of that 80s pop Clapton stuff, like Journeyman in that era. No Alibi is a great song. It's in the way that you use it. And the other one that was kind of part of that was Forever Man, which, it's a great rock and roll song, man. It is what it is. I'm not a huge Clapton guy, but Revel Man, Revel Man, Revel Man, it's good. I like it. So anyway, that's what's in my head. Oh, I'm going to tack one more on there, and that's Goodbye by the Spice Girls. And that's because of the Peloton cool down that I've been doing a lot. Do you do the 5-minute cool downs after that you do your rides?
No, after my ride, I'm done, man. Nope. No, I've never done the cool down. I'll try one. You got to
do the cool down, and the Spice Girls cool down is outstanding. It's their song Goodbye, which I didn't even know. Something I didn't even know about. But hey, there it is. Spice Girls. Okay. All right, buddy. Well, no better way to wrap it up than with those ladies. But hey, thanks. That was great. Great to be back on the team here, doing our thing, doing a regular episode. It's been a while. The last one we did was Pearl Jam. Feels like months ago. Probably was months ago, but nice to talk about Phish with you, Nub. And maybe sometime in the future, we'll go see Phish.
Go see Phish. Yeah. Good choice, man. Really love talking about it. And we'll see you again in a couple of weeks, eh?
We sure will. So keep in mind, we're doing every 2 weeks. So we will see you in 2 weeks for episode 69. Okay.
Is that right?
69, dude. We made it. We did it.
Landmark episode. Landmark.
For those of you that don't know, our whole goal, the whole reason for doing this podcast was to get to episode 69. That was it.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Nubs, you really better bring the heat on that one. You know what I mean?
Well, I'll be bringing the heat on episode 69. There's no question.
Well, we will see you then for episode 69 in a couple weeks. But in the meantime, we hope you enjoyed today's Yam Band special. And we hope that you all are doing okay and staying safe out there. Watch the Omicron there, bud. Watch the cornhole, bud. All right? Be careful. All right? Yeah. And we'll see you in a couple weeks. Here on Two Twins. Yeah, and an album. Y'all take care.
Two twins and an album.
Well, that's about it. That's all we have. I hope it wasn't too disappointing. We will see you on tour. Until then, take it easy.